It might mess with your head to realize this, but we're living in an ice age right now. Seriously. It started about 2.6 million years ago, and technically, it hasn't ended. And here's the even wilder part. Every 100,000 years, like clockwork, our planet goes through this insane transformation. Massive ice sheets cover huge chunks of the continents, and then they melt away again. It's a cycle that has shaped the evolution of life on Earth for millions of years. Before we get into the science of it all, I think it's important to understand just what this cycle creates. When Earth tips into a full glacial period, the planet becomes home to some of the most bizarre and magnificent creatures that have ever existed. I'm talking woolly mammoths trudging through frozen grasslands, giant ground sloths digging tunnels the size of your house, and saber-toothed cats hunting prey that weighed several tons. Then, about 10,000 years ago, most of these incredible animals just vanished. The cycle shifted, ice melted, and suddenly the megafauna that had dominated the planet for hundreds of thousands of years couldn't make it. We're still trying to figure out exactly why. Climate change, humans, or both. The debate is still raging. So let's break down this 100,000-year cycle, how it works, why it happens, what kind of world it creates during the cold phases, and what happens when it shifts back to warm. We'll meet the creatures that thrived in Ice Age conditions, learn how humans survived and adapted, and understand why it all came crashing down so recently. And at the end, we'll talk about where we are in the cycle right now and what that means for our future. Let's start with the basics. An ice age isn't just a cold period. It's an extended chunk of time, we're talking millions of years, where Earth's temperature drops enough that massive ice sheets and glaciers take over large portions of the planet's surface. And as I said, we're currently in the Pleistocene Ice Age, which kicked off about 2.6 million years ago, and technically hasn't ended yet. Now, within any ice age, you get fluctuations. There are glacial periods where it's really frozen, and interglacial periods where it warms up. We're in an interglacial period right now, and have been for about 11,700 years. So when people say the Ice Age, they usually mean the last glacial period, which lasted from about 115,000 years ago to 11,700 years ago. That's when the ice sheets were at their biggest and the megafauna were running the show. During that last glacial period, the temperature was only about 6 degrees Celsius colder than today on average. 6 degrees doesn't sound like much, right? But we're not talking about 6 degrees in one spot. We're talking about 6 degrees worth of thermal energy being sucked out of the entire planet, all the oceans, all the land masses, the whole atmosphere. That's enough to completely transform the world. Huge ice sheets covered most of Canada and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe were kilometers thick in some places. Because so much water was locked up in ice, sea levels dropped by over 100 meters. You could walk from England to France. You could stroll from Asia to Alaska, across what's now the Bering Strait. The coastlines were completely different, and the landscape was mostly tundra and cold grasslands, dry and windswept, nothing like the forests we see today. So what caused this? Why does Earth go through these dramatic swings every 100,000 years? The answer starts with this Serbian scientist named Milankovitch. Back in the early 1900s, this guy figured out something nobody else had really considered. What if ice ages weren't caused by anything happening on Earth, but by changes in Earth's position relative to the Sun? See, Earth's orbit isn't perfectly circular. It's slightly elliptical, and the shape of that ellipse changes over time because of gravitational pulls from other planets, mainly Jupiter and Saturn. Sometimes our orbit is more circular, sometimes it's more stretched out. And this cycle of changing from circular to elliptical and back takes about 100,000 years. That's the first Milankovitch cycle, called eccentricity. When Earth's orbit is highly elliptical, the distance between Earth and the Sun varies more dramatically throughout the year. This affects how much solar radiation hits different parts of the planet at different times. And here's the crucial part. It's not about how much total sunlight Earth gets. It's about where and when that sunlight hits. Northern Hemisphere summers are the key because that's where most of the land is. If Northern Hemisphere summers are cool enough that winter snow doesn't fully melt, the snow sticks around. Year after year, it piles up. Eventually, you've got ice sheets forming. And once ice sheets start growing, they reflect more sunlight back into space, which cools things down even more, which allows more ice to form. It's a runaway feedback loop. But eccentricity isn't the only cycle. There's also obliquity, which is the tilt of Earth's axis. The more tilted Earth is, the more extreme the seasons. This tilt varies on a roughly 41,000-year cycle. When Earth is less tilted, the difference between summer and winter is milder, which means summer might not be warm enough to melt all the winter ice. Ice accumulates, ice age begins. The third cycle is precession, or wobble. Earth wobbles on its axis it's strange to think that the Earth is in some ways like a spinning top that's starting to slow down. The wobble changes which hemisphere tilted toward the Sun during different parts of its orbit, and it happens on a 26,000-year cycle. This affects the contrast between seasons. Right now, the Northern Hemisphere has winter, when Earth is closest to the Sun, so our winters are milder than they would be otherwise. But during other parts of the precession cycle, that flips, and our winters can be much colder. When you combine all three of these cycles, eccentricity, obliquity, and precession, they work together to control Earth's long-term climate. What's really odd is that the 100,000-year eccentricity cycle is actually the weakest of the three in terms of how much it changes incoming solar radiation. The other two cycles should matter more. But when scientists started drilling cores out of ocean sediments and ice sheets to reconstruct past climate, they found that the dominant pattern is 100,000 years. The weak cycle somehow dominates the whole system. This is called the 100,000-year problem, and scientists are still trying to fully explain it. The leading idea is that there are feedback mechanisms that amplify the eccentricity cycle. Maybe it takes a long time to build up ice sheets, but they can collapse relatively quickly. So, the system spends most of its time slowly building ice during the cool phases of the cycle, then rapidly melts when conditions shift to warming. This asymmetry could explain why the 100,000-year pattern shows up so strongly. But here's what we know for the past million years or so, Earth has been going through these 100,000-year climate cycles. Slow buildup of ice over tens of thousands of years, then relatively rapid melting, then another slow buildup. And during the cold phases, The world became a stage for some of the most incredible animals ever to walk the planet. The megafauna, that's what we called them, and the word mega is no exaggeration. Some of these creatures weighed 4,500 kilograms or more. There are theories about why everything got so big during ice ages. One idea is Bergmann's rule, which says that in cold climates, mammals tend to be larger because a bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio. Less surface area relative to volume means less heat loss. So bigger bodies stay warm more efficiently in the cold. That's why polar bears are bigger than other bear species, and why Ice Age mammals tended toward the gigantic. But size alone doesn't tell the whole story. These animals had incredible adaptations for surviving in a frozen world. The most famous one, the poster child of the Ice Age, is the woolly mammoth. Woolly mammoths weren't actually as huge as you might think. They were about the same size as modern elephants, maybe a bit shorter, but they were built completely differently. They had thick, shaggy fur with 2 layers, a dense underwool, and longer outer guard hairs. This coat could be up to a meter long in places and provided insulation so good that mammoths could handle temperatures of 40 degrees or colder. They also had small ears to minimize heat loss, unlike modern elephants with their big floppy ears used for cooling off. And they had a layer of fat up to 9 cm thick for extra insulation and energy storage. Their skulls were specially shaped too, with large sinus cavities that helped warm and humidify the cold, dry air before it reached their lungs. Breathing in super cold air can damage your lungs, so this was a crucial adaptation. And their teeth were perfect for grinding the tough grasses and sedges that grew on the mammoth steppe. This unique cold grassland ecosystem that covered huge areas during glacial periods. As their teeth wore down, new ones would move forward from the back of the jaw. A mammoth would go through 6 sets of teeth in its lifetime. We know so much about mammoths because some have been found frozen in permafrost, almost perfectly preserved with fur, skin, and even stomach contents intact. Scientists have studied what they ate, extracted their DNA, and found that they had special hemoglobin variants that worked better in the cold, allowing their blood to deliver oxygen more efficiently in freezing temperatures. These animals were finely tuned for Ice Age conditions. But mammoths weren't alone. The Ice Age world was packed with megafauna. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed the same landscapes, covered in thick fur with massive horns that could reach over a meter long. They used these horns to plow through snow to reach vegetation underneath. Giant ground sloths lived in the Americas, and these weren't the cute little tree sloths we know today. Some species weighed several tons and could stand up to 4 men out tall on their hind legs. They were too big to climb trees, so they lived on the ground, feeding on vegetation and, incredibly, digging burrows. We found their burrows, tunnels up to 40 mm long, with claw marks on the walls that matched their fossilized claws perfectly. They were glyptodonts, basically car-sized armadillos with shells made of fused bone plates. They couldn't roll up like modern armadillos, but they didn't need to. Their shells were tough enough to stop most predators, and some species had club-like tails covered in bony spikes that they could swing as weapons. Recent studies suggest they might have been able to rear up on their hind legs, which means you could have had these armored tanks standing upright and swinging spiked clubs. That's both awesome and terrifying, And then there were the predators. Saber-toothed cats prowled the Americas with canine teeth up to 18 centimeters long, curved like daggers. They used these to deliver killing bites to the throat or belly of prey, causing massive bleeding. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern lions. Giant, short-faced bears in North America might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever, standing over 3 mm tall on the hind legs. Dire wolves hunted in packs and had more powerful jaws. The ice melted, just like it had countless times before. But something was different this time. Around 11,700 years ago, when the ice receded, most of the megafauna didn't make it. Within a few thousand years, they were gone. I still find myself wondering why the cycle that had sustained them for so long suddenly failed. Was the warming too fast? Or had humans, evolving and spreading during these cycles, finally developed the technology and the sheer numbers to hunt these magnificent animals to extinction? Or perhaps it was some combination of both. I want to understand what actually happens during one of these 100,000-year cycles. What did the planet look like at peak glaciation? How did these megafauna survive? And most importantly, what triggered the transition from glacial to interglacial periods? And why did it spell doom for so many species this time around? Let's picture the last glacial maximum about 20,000 years ago. The 100,000-year cycle hit its coldest point. Ice sheets at their absolute peak. The world was nothing like today. Nothing. Ice sheets covered all of Canada, reaching down into what's now the northern United States. Ice up to 3 kilometers thick in some places. To give you a sense of scale, that's like stacking the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, on top of itself more than 3 times. Except it wasn't steel and glass, but solid ice covering an area the size of a continent. The weight of all that ice was so enormous that it pressed down on the Earth's crust beneath it, deforming the solid rock. Europe had its own massive ice sheet, the Fennoscandian, blanketing Scandinavia, the Baltic, parts of Britain, and northern Russia. Between these 2 ice sheets, we are talking about maybe 15 million cubic kilometers of ice sitting on land. If you took all that ice and spread it evenly over the entire land surface of Earth, it would be about 100 meters deep everywhere. It's an almost incomprehensible amount of water, frozen solid. And with all that water locked up on land, sea levels dropped, not by a few meters, but by 120 meters. That's as tall as a 40-story building. Coastlines extended way beyond where they are today. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. Indonesia, which is now thousands of islands, was mostly a single landmass connected to mainland Asia. Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed one giant continent, and between Alaska and Siberia, where the Bering Strait is today, was this huge grassy plain called Beringia. The world map looked completely different. But it's not just that the coastlines changed. The climate was totally different. It wasn't just colder, it was drier, way drier. With so much water locked in ice, and with colder ocean temperatures reducing evaporation, there was simply less moisture in the atmosphere. Deserts expanded, rainforests shrank to tiny pockets. What's now the Amazon basin was much drier, probably a mix of grassland and scattered trees. The Sahara was even bigger than it is today. Large parts of the world were covered in tundra or steppe, cold, dry grasslands with almost no trees. The ice sheets acted like giant refrigerators, generating cold, dense air that would flow off the ice in powerful winds. These winds picked up dust and silt from the exposed ground and carried it hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Some parts of China have dust deposits over 100 meters thick that accumulated during glacial periods. The dust storms must have been incredible, blotting out the sun for days at a time. This was the world at peak glaciation, harsh, cold, dry, and windswept. And yet, life not only survived here, it thrived. The megafauna we talked about earlier weren't just barely scraping by. They were dominating these ecosystems, existing in numbers that probably matched or exceeded the density of large animals in Africa today. The mammoth steppe was the dominant ecosystem across huge swaths of the northern hemisphere. This was a type of grassland that doesn't really exist anymore. A unique mix of grasses, sedges, herbs, and low shrubs that could handle cold, dry conditions. And it supported enormous populations of large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, all grazing together in huge herds. It must have been an incredible sight. Mammoths were the most iconic, but they weren't the only giants. Woolly rhinoceros were just as impressive, similar in size to modern rhinos, but built for the cold. They had thick, woolly coats, 2 horns, with the front one being absolutely massive, sometimes over a meter long. And they used these horns as snow plows to clear away snow and reach the vegetation underneath. We found woolly rhinos preserved in permafrost too, just like mammoths, with their fur and soft tissue intact. And like mammoths, they show clear adaptations for extreme cold, including small ears and thick layers of fat. Giant ground sloths were dominating the Americas. Now, modern sloths are these cute, slow-moving animals that hang in rainforest trees, but Ice Age ground sloths were nothing like that. The largest species, Megatherium americanum, had an estimated body mass of 3,800 kilograms. That's heavier than most elephants. They could stand on their hind legs and reach heights of 4 meters or more. These were elephant-sized sloths, too big to climb trees, living on the ground and feeding on vegetation. And here's where it gets really interesting. We've found their burrows. Actual tunnels dug into hillsides, some of them 40 meters long and nearly 2 meters wide. The walls. Imagine encountering a multi-ton sloth emerging from an underground tunnel. It sounds made up, doesn't it? But these creatures were real, and they left their mark on the world in surprising ways. The ceilings of some of their burrows still bear the claw marks, a lasting testament to their immense size and power. These burrows, scientists believe, offered refuge from extreme temperatures or a place to hide from predators. It's fascinating to consider the daily lives of these giants and the challenges they faced. Another bizarre group was the glyptodons, relatives of modern armadillos, but scaled up to ridiculous proportions. They weighed up to 2 tons and lumbered around on elephant-sized legs. Their bodies were encased in shells made of hundreds of bony plates fused together, much like a turtle, but far larger and heavier. These shells could be over 1.5 meters long, a formidable defense against almost any predator. Some glyptodon species even had tails covered in bony rings with spikes on the end, essentially a medieval mace attached to their bodies. Recent biomechanical studies suggest they could rear up on their hind legs, transforming these armored tanks into upright, tail-swinging weapons. Absolutely wild, isn't it? The diversity of megafauna during the Ice Age is truly staggering. In North America alone, there were mammoths, mastodons, a different family of proboscideans with distinct tooth structures, American horses, American camels, giant beavers the size of bears, stag moose with enormous antlers, and multiple species of giant ground sloths. South America boasted even more ground sloth species, along with glyptodons, giant armadillos, toxodons, hippopotamus-sized rodent relatives, and macrochenia, which looked like a bizarre cross between a camel and a small elephant with a trunk. Eurasia was home to mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, steppe bison, and giant deer called Megalocharus, with antlers spanning over 3.5 meters. And of course, there were the predators. Wherever you find large herbivores, you'll also find large carnivores hunting them. Saber-toothed cats are perhaps the most famous Ice Age predator. Smilodon in the Americas possessed those incredible canine teeth, up to 18 centimeters long and flattened like blades. These weren't for crushing bone or gripping. They were precision killing tools. Smilodon would use its powerful forelimbs to wrestle prey to the ground, then deliver a killing bite to the throat or belly, severing major blood vessels and causing rapid death from blood loss. The La Brea tar pits in California have preserved thousands of Ice Age animal bones, and saber-toothed cats are among the most common carnivores found there. This suggests they were successful predators, likely living in social groups like modern lions. And their prey was far from small. They took down bison, young mammoths, horses, and giant ground sloths, big, dangerous animals. Cave lions in Europe and Asia were larger than modern African lions and probably hunted similar prey. Cave bears, despite their scary name, were mostly herbivorous, but they were huge, up to half a ton, and their size alone made them formidable. Then there were the giant short-faced bears in North America, which might have been the largest mammalian land predators ever to exist. These bears stood over 3 meters tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 800 kilograms. There's debate about whether they were active predators or scavengers, but either way, you definitely wouldn't want to run into one. Dire wolves were another major predator, especially in the Americas. Real dire wolves, not the fantasy version. They were larger and more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with more powerful jaws designed for crushing bone. They hunted in packs and could take down prey much larger than themselves through coordinated attacks. The La Brea tar pits have yielded thousands of dire wolf fossils, more than any other carnivore, suggesting they were incredibly common. Even birds got in on the megafauna action. Teratorns were some of the largest flying birds ever, with wingspans over 3.5 meters. They probably soared on thermals like modern condors, searching for carrion, and there were even larger flightless birds in some regions. The Ice Age world had no shortage of impressive and terrifying predators. But here's what's really fascinating. All of these animals, from the smallest ground squirrels to the largest mammoths, were part of functioning ecosystems. They weren't just wandering around randomly. They had complex relationships with each other and with their environment. Herbivores competed for food and space, predators hunted herbivores, scavengers cleaned up the remains, and plants evolved to withstand grazing prey. It was all interconnected. The megafauna themselves were ecosystem engineers. Mammoths, for example, didn't just eat grass. They knocked down trees, creating and maintaining open grasslands. They distributed nutrients across the landscape through their dung. They created trails and wallows. Their actions shaped the entire ecosystem. When you have animals that weigh several tons moving through an environment, they have a huge impact. Scientists have reconstructed these ancient ecosystems using multiple lines of evidence. Fossil assemblages tell us which animals lived together in the same places. Isotope analysis of bones and teeth tells us what they ate and what the climate was like. Ancient DNA can be extracted from permafrost sediments, even from sediments with no visible fossils. And this tells us which species were present. Cave paintings created by humans show what animals looked like and how they behaved. By combining all this evidence, we can paint a pretty detailed picture of Ice Age life. One thing that's become clear is that these ecosystems weren't static. They changed and shifted as the climate fluctuated. Remember, even within a glacial period, there were shorter-term climate variations. Events called Dansgaard-Oeschger oscillations caused rapid warming spikes lasting decades to centuries, then rapid cooling again. The world of the Ice Age was dynamic, constantly shifting. Temperatures rose and fell, reshaping habitats, vegetation, and the fortunes of entire species. Humans, too, were players in this drama. We lived alongside mammoths and other megafauna, hunting them, competing with predators, and honing our tools and cultures to survive in a world gripped by ice. In Europe, Neanderthals had already weathered hundreds of thousands of years of these cycles. They were built for the cold, stocky with large noses to warm the frigid air. Their tools were sophisticated. They hunted the megafauna, crafted complex weapons, mastered fire, and even expressed themselves through art and burial rituals. Then, around 45,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived, bringing new technologies, more complex social structures, and wider trade networks. We overlapped with the Neanderthals for millennia, sharing the land, even interbreeding. It's why many people of European or Asian descent carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA within them. Across the globe, modern humans adapted to Ice Age conditions, coexisting with megafauna in Asia, Australia, which humans reached at least 65,000 years ago, and eventually the Americas. The nature of our interactions with these giant creatures is still debated. Imagine standing at the height of the last glacial maximum, surveying a landscape of ice sheets and cold grasslands, mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant sloths lumbering across the horizon. It's a sight that will likely never be seen again. These ecosystems are gone, the megafauna extinct, the mammoth steppe replaced by forests and tundra. It's a lost world. But that world was shaped by those 100,000-year cycles. The cold phases created the very conditions to which life adapted. For hundreds of millennia, the pattern repeated. Cold, megafauna thrive. Warm, forests expand. Then cold again, and the megafauna return. Life on Earth seemed to dance to this rhythm. Then, around 19,000 years ago, the music began to change. Orbital cycles shifted, favoring warming. Northern Hemisphere summers grew more intense, and the ice sheets began to melt. The transition from the last glacial period to our current interglacial was one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent Earth history. And caught in the middle were these megafauna, creatures evolved to thrive in a frozen world. Most wouldn't survive. We know what these Ice Age giants looked like, but let's explore how they lived. The more we learn, the more remarkable they become. Consider this: giant ground sloths digging massive burrows. When scientists first stumbled upon these tunnels in South America, particularly in Argentina, they were baffled. These burrows were immense, some plunging 5 to 6 meters below the surface, stretching up to 40 meters long and 1.8 meters wide, a two-story house worth of tunnel underground. Several mammal species were considered as potential diggers, but the evidence increasingly pointed to ground sloths, like Glossotherium and Celidotherium. The first clue was their arm bones. Ground sloth forelimbs were designed like shovels with unusually long second and third fingers, perfect for digging. These bones were incredibly strong, able to withstand the bending forces needed to dig through hard soil, forces similar to those experienced by galloping mammals. Then there was their center of gravity. Paleontologists realized that ground sloths had their center of gravity above their hind feet, allowing them to rear up on two legs. This bipedal posture was essential for digging, freeing their arms to excavate. You simply can't dig effectively on all fours. The final piece of the puzzle? Claw marks on the walls and ceilings of the burrows, perfectly preserved. When the scientists compared these marks to ground sloth hand skeletons, they matched exactly. These sloths weren't just big. They were engineering vast underground structures despite weighing 800 to 1,200 kilos. Why? The leading theories suggest temperature regulation or predator avoidance. Underground temperatures are far more stable than on the surface, offering refuge from extreme heat or cold. Or perhaps they were hiding from saber-toothed cats or giant short-faced bears. When you're large but slow, going underground is a smart defense. Either way, it demonstrates a behavioral complexity we might not expect from something called a giant sloth. There's another fascinating discovery. In Ecuador, at a site called Tanque Loma, paleontologists unearthed the remains of at least 22 Eremotherium sloths of varying ages, all in one location. They likely perished during a drought, trapped in a shrinking watering hole. But what's truly remarkable is what this reveals about their behavior. They congregated at watering holes, suggesting they were social animals living in groups. They likely wallowed in the water to escape heat and insects, much like hippos and rhinos do today. Wait, wow! It still amazes me that even during an ice age, not everywhere was frozen solid. Tropical and subtropical regions still experienced warm seasons. The climate, while cooler and drier than today, didn't plunge equatorial regions under ice sheets. Animals there still had to cope with heat during the hottest times of the year. It's fascinating to consider ground sloths in South America employing similar strategies to those of large African mammals today, all to beat the heat. The Ice Age wasn't a planet-wide deep freeze. Speaking of amazing, let's return to the mammoths. We keep unearthing incredible new details about them, especially those preserved in the Siberian permafrost. Some have even had their last meals perfectly preserved in their stomachs. When scientists examined this material, they found grasses, sedges, herbs, flowers, and mosses. I find this so evocative. It paints a clear picture of the mammoth steppe ecosystem and the plants that sustain them, but the story gets even richer. We've extracted DNA from these frozen mammoths and sequenced their entire genomes. This genetic analysis has revealed some remarkable adaptations. Mammoths, it turns out, possessed variants of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in blood, that functioned more effectively at cold temperatures. Normal hemoglobin struggles to release oxygen efficiently when it's cold, a major problem for an animal in freezing conditions. Mammoth hemoglobin had mutations that compensated, ensuring their blood delivered oxygen even when their body tissues were cold. That's hardcore molecular adaptation. Beyond that, we've discovered that mammoths possessed genes for smaller ears, fewer sweat glands, and enhanced fat storage, all encoded in their DNA. Evolution didn't just alter their appearance, it fundamentally rewired their physiology at a genetic level. And here's a poignant detail. The last mammoths to ever exist lived on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean. When sea levels rose after the ice sheets melted, this island became isolated from the mainland. A population of about 500 to 1,000 mammoths survived there until about 4,000 years ago. Imagine that. That's after the pyramids of Giza were built. Mammoths and ancient civilizations overlapped in time. The last of these giants roamed a remote Arctic island while humans in Egypt were constructing monuments and developing writing. Ultimately, they went extinct, likely due to a combination of inbreeding, habitat degradation on their small island, and perhaps climate change or human arrival. The end of an evolutionary line that had persisted for millions of years. Woolly rhinoceroses are another species we know a great deal about thanks to frozen specimens. Like mammoths, they had thick, woolly coats and were built for the cold. Yet their behavior likely differed based on tooth wear and the isotopes in their bones. Scientists believe woolly rhinos were more selective feeders than mammoths, while mammoths were bulk grazers, consuming whatever vegetation was available. Woolly rhinos seemed pickier, likely using their horns to dig through snow for specific plants. The giant deer, Megafauna, had antlers that were truly astounding. The largest specimens had antlers spanning over 3.5 meters from tip to tip, wider than a car. These antlers could weigh up to 40 kilograms. Carrying that much weight on your head demands serious neck and shoulder muscles. Scientists theorize that these massive antlers were primarily for display and competition between males, much like modern deer. During mating season, males would flaunt their antlers to females and use them in battles with rivals. The bigger the antlers, the more impressive the display. But those antlers came at a cost. Growing them required vast amounts of calcium and energy, and carrying them around was energetically expensive. Only the healthiest, best-fed males could support truly enormous antlers. Cave bears are interesting because, despite their name and size, they were mostly herbivorous. Isotope analysis of their bones reveals they primarily ate plants. They were built like grizzly bears but behaved more like giant pandas. They hibernated in caves during winter, which is where we find most of their fossils. Some caves in Europe contain thousands of cave bear bones, representing hundreds or thousands of individuals that hibernated there over millennia. Cave bears went extinct earlier than many other megafauna, around 27,000 to 24,000 years ago, well before the end of the last glacial period. The reasons remain somewhat unclear, but might involve competition with humans for cave space, climate changes affecting their food supply, or a combination of these factors. And then there are the glyptodonts. The more I learn about them, the more they blow my mind. Recent studies of their skeletal structure and muscle attachment points suggest they were capable of some surprising behaviors. They might have been able to rear up, but they also show adaptations for powerful digging, similar to modern armadillos, but on a massive scale. So, these armored giants might have dug burrows, like their ground sloth contemporaries. Imagine tunnels big enough for a Volkswagen Beetle to drive through, created by armored animals with spiky tails. The Ice Age was truly wild. The predators of the Ice Age were just as specialized as the herbivores. Saber-toothed cats didn't just have those impressive fangs for show. Biomechanical studies of their skulls show they had relatively weak bite forces compared to modern big cats, but their neck muscles were incredibly powerful. The hunting strategy was probably to use their strong forelimbs to wrestle prey down, then use their neck muscles to drive those saber teeth deep into the prey's throat or belly with precision. It wasn't about crushing force, it was about precise strikes. I have always been fascinated by the dire wolf. Imagine a creature so powerful that its bite could sever major blood vessels with a single snap. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? And we know so much about them, thanks to the La Brea tar pits. Thousands of dire wolves trapped over millennia. There remains a stark reminder of a lost world. Studying those fossils, I've noticed something poignant. Many show signs of broken teeth, healed fractures, arthritis, evidence of lives that were not always easy, yet they survived, often into old age. This suggests a complex social structure, a pack that cared for its injured and elderly, sharing food when individual hunting became impossible. It speaks to a level of cooperation and empathy that resonates even now. The giant short-faced bear, though, remains more enigmatic. Was it a predator, a scavenger, or perhaps both? Its long legs suggest an ability to cover vast distances ideal for scavenging. But those powerful jaws and teeth, they were clearly capable of taking down prey. Perhaps it was opportunistic, hunting when it could, scavenging when it had to. I picture it as a massive bully, intimidating smaller predators like dire wolves, stealing their kills. A pack of wolves brings down a bison only for this giant to appear, scattering them and claiming the prize. One of the most remarkable things about studying the Ice Age is how we can piece together its ecosystems from the most unexpected places. Ancient DNA preserved in sediments. Even without bones, frozen soil can hold the genetic secrets of animals long gone. Scientists have developed incredible techniques to extract and identify this environmental DNA, revealing which species lived where and when. It fills in the gaps in the fossil record, showing us a world even more diverse than we previously imagined. We've found horse DNA in areas where horse fossils are absent, identified ancient plants from pollen and DNA, even determined past climates by analyzing the species of plants and insects present. It's like reading an ancient ecological record written in the language of DNA. And then there are the humans. They observed and interacted with this megafauna, leaving their own records of what they saw. The cave art, like that in Lascaux and Chauvet, is astonishing. Remarkably accurate depictions of mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, horses, cave lions. These aren't crude drawings. They're sophisticated artworks, capturing movement and using the cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. The artists clearly spent countless hours observing these animals to capture them so faithfully. Some paintings even show details like fur patterns, seasonal coat changes, and behavioral poses. It's a direct visual record of what Ice Age megafauna looked like, created by people who saw them alive. Beyond art, there are the butchered animal bones, the mammoth bones with embedded spear points, the campsites with hearths surrounded by the remains of horses, bison, and reindeer. The archaeological record confirms that humans hunted megafauna and relied on them for food, tools, clothing, and fuel. Mammoth ivory was carved into art and tools. Hides were used for clothing and shelter. Bones were used to build dwellings in areas where wood was scarce. Every part of these animals was utilized. But humans weren't just passive observers or simple hunters. There's evidence they may have used fire to manage landscapes, creating and maintaining the open grasslands that megafauna depended on. By burning vegetation regularly, they could prevent forests from encroaching, keeping habitats open for the large herbivores they hunted. This kind of ecosystem engineering might have actually helped support megafauna populations in some regions. The relationship between humans and megafauna was complex, far from a simple predator-prey dynamic. For hundreds of thousands of years, a pattern repeated. Ice sheets advanced, megafauna thrived, ice sheets retreated, forests expanded, and then the cycle began again. Life adapted to this rhythm, but about 19,000 years ago, the cycle began shifting toward warming again. And this time, something was different. This time, humans had spread across most of the world, developed sophisticated hunting technologies, and existed in larger numbers than ever before. This time, when the climate started changing and the ice began to melt, the megafauna wouldn't just adapt and wait for the cycle to swing back to cold as they had for so long. This time, most of them were going to disappear forever, and we're still debating exactly why. So, around 19,000 years ago, that 100,000-year cycle reached a turning point. The orbital configuration shifted, favoring warming. Northern Hemisphere summers started getting stronger, receiving more solar radiation, and when that happens, winter snow melts more completely each summer. Ice sheets stop growing and begin their long retreat. The transition from glacial to interglacial conditions was underway. The thing about deglaciation is that it's not smooth at all. It's a messy process of fits and starts, with sudden collapses and temporary reversals. There are periods of rapid change that people living at the time would have certainly noticed, and this messiness is exactly what makes understanding the megafauna extinction so complicated. The first major pulse of melting began around 19,000 years ago and continued for several millennia. Sea levels rose as the ice sheets melted, pouring water back into the oceans. During meltwater pulse 1A, around 14,600 years ago, sea levels rose roughly 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters might not sound like much, but it's enough to flood vast coastal areas, submerge land bridges, and completely transform coastlines. All that water had to come from somewhere, of course. It came from collapsing sections of the great ice sheets. The Laurentide ice sheet, that massive dome of ice covering Canada, began breaking apart, and the Fennoscandian ice sheet in Europe did the same. As they melted, they left behind a landscape that had been compressed under kilometers of ice for thousands of years. The land was scraped clean, covered in glacial till, and dotted with lakes formed in depressions carved by ice. It must have been a raw, bare landscape at first, slowly being colonized by plants as the climate warmed. But the warming wasn't steady. There were dramatic interruptions, the most famous being the Younger Dryas event. By around 14 to 700 years ago, the world had been warming for thousands of years. Ice sheets were retreating, and things seemed to be heading toward interglacial conditions. Then suddenly, temperatures crashed. In Greenland, temperatures dropped by about 15 degrees Celsius in just a few decades, maybe even faster. Some evidence suggests it could have happened in as little as 10 to 20 years. The North Atlantic region was plunged back into near glacial conditions that lasted over 1,000 years. The leading theory involves a catastrophic flood. As the Laurentide ice sheet melted, water pooled up behind it, forming enormous glacial lakes. The largest was Glacial Lake Agassiz, bigger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. This lake was dammed in by the ice sheet itself, and when that ice dam failed, geological evidence suggests it did multiple times. Absolutely stupendous amounts of fresh water flooded into the ocean in a geologically instant time frame. We're talking about enough water to raise global sea levels by several meters, all released in months to years. This massive fresh water dump disrupted ocean circulation in the North Atlantic. There's an ocean circulation pattern called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMOC. It's a conveyor belt where warm surface water flows north, cools down near Greenland, becomes dense and sinks, then flows south at depth. This circulation transports enormous amounts of heat from the tropics to the northern hemisphere. But fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you dump a huge amount of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it floats on top and prevents the normal sinking of cold, dense water. This can slow down or shut down the AMOC, and when the AMOC stops, the Northern Hemisphere stops receiving that massive heat transport from the tropics, temperatures crash, and you're back to near glacial conditions. The Younger Dryas had effects far beyond the North Atlantic. Climate patterns shifted across the globe. Some regions got drier, others wetter. Temperatures changed, and this had huge impacts on ecosystems and the animals living in them. For megafauna that were already stressed by changing habitats as the climate warmed and forests expanded, the Younger Dryas cold snap might have provided a temporary reprieve, but it also added instability to an already unstable situation. It had major impacts on human societies, too. In the Middle East, this is right around the time agriculture first developed. Some scientists think the climate stress of the Younger Dryas might have pushed hunter-gatherer groups to start deliberately cultivating plants as a way to end food security when wild resources became unreliable. If that's true, Then this climate event triggered by the 100,000-year cycle transitioning from glacial to interglacial literally changed the course of human history, setting us on the path to farming, settled civilizations, and everything that followed. But eventually, around 11,700 years ago, the Younger Dryas ended, just as abruptly as it started. Temperatures spiked upward again. In some regions, temperatures rose by 10 degrees Celsius or more in just a decade or two. That's mind-bogglingly fast for natural climate change. The AMOC kicked back into gear. Heat flooded northward again. Ice sheets resumed their collapse. And this time, there was no going back. The transition to full interglacial conditions was complete. We call this the beginning of the Holocene, our current geological epoch, and it marks the end of the last glacial period. For the megafauna, this was catastrophic. They had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to thrive in cold, open grassland environments. But as the Holocene began, those environments were disappearing. The mammoth steppe, that unique ecosystem of cold grasslands that had supported enormous populations of large herbivores, was transforming. Forests were expanding, grasslands were shrinking, and the climate was getting wetter and warmer. For animals adapted to cold and dry conditions, this was a crisis, and the extinctions came fast. In North America, most megafauna disappeared between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. Mammoths, mastodons, horses, camels, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, giant short-faced bears, all gone within a few thousand years. That's 70 to 80% of large mammal species just vanished. It's a staggering loss. It was a devastating event they call the Quaternary Extinction. Across Europe, similar losses occurred, though the exact timing shifted depending on the species. The woolly mammoths vanished from most places, clinging to existence only in isolated spots like Wrangler Island. Woolly rhinos disappeared entirely. Cave lions were gone. The giant deer died out. The megafauna that had dominated Europe during the Ice Age were either gone completely or drastically reduced. South America suffered similar losses. Giant ground sloths, every species that had evolved there gone, glyptodonts gone, native horses and camels extinct. Toxodons, macrochenia, and giant armadillos all gone. The extinction wave swept through the Americas with terrifying speed. Australia had already lost most of its megafauna even earlier, between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, massive flightless birds, even a marsupial lion, all disappeared. The timing in Australia seems to coincide more with the arrival of humans than with the last glaciation. And that adds another layer to the puzzle of what caused these extinctions. What killed them? It's a question that's been debated for decades, and honestly, it's still not completely settled. There are two main schools of thought, the climate change hypothesis and the human hunting hypothesis. The truth, I suspect, is a combination of both, with the relative importance of each varying by region and species. The climate change hypothesis suggests that the rapid warming and ecosystem transformation were simply more than these animals could handle. Megafauna had evolved for cold, open habitats. When those habitats disappeared in just a few thousand years, they couldn't adapt quickly enough. As forests expanded and grasslands shrank, megafauna populations became fragmented into smaller and smaller pockets of suitable habitat. And small isolated populations are especially vulnerable to inbreeding, disease, and random environmental fluctuations. This creates an extinction vortex, where declining populations face multiple threats that compound each other, making recovery impossible. There's certainly good evidence for climate being a major factor. The extinctions happened during a period of incredibly rapid climate change. Species adapted to cold climates like woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos went extinct, while species adapted to forests or warmer climates generally survived. That pattern strongly suggests climate played a significant role. Also, the megafauna had survived previous deglaciations. The 100,000-year cycle means there were multiple transitions from glacial to interglacial conditions over the past few million years. If megafauna survived those, why not this one? That's where the human hunting hypothesis comes in. Modern humans had spread across most of the world by the end of the last ice age, and humans are incredibly effective hunters, especially with the technological innovations that developed during this period. Atlatls, spear throwers that dramatically extend your range and power, sophisticated hunting strategies involving coordinated groups, and later, bows and arrows. Human populations were growing and spreading into new territories. And critically, many megafauna had little or no evolutionary experience with human hunters when humans first arrived in the Americas or Australia. The local megafauna hadn't evolved fear responses to these two-legged predators. They were, in a sense, naive prey. Modern examples show this pattern. When humans first reached oceanic islands with no previous human presence, the native birds and mammals often showed no fear and were easily hunted to extinction within decades or centuries. The same might have happened with Ice Age megafauna. They simply didn't recognize humans as threats until it was too late. And here's the thing about hunting megafauna. You don't need to hunt intensively to drive them extinct. These animals have slow reproductive rates. A female mammoth might have a calf only every 5 years, and mammoths don't reach sexual maturity until they're teens. If you kill even a few individuals per year from a population, especially females of reproductive age, you can drive the entire population into decline. Mathematical models show that even very low-intensity hunting, killing just a few % of the population per year, can drive large-bodied animals extinct over centuries or millennia. And we know humans hunted megafauna. We found butchered mammoth bones at human sites, spear points embedded in mammoth ribs, kill sites where multiple animals were driven off cliffs or into traps, and then butchered, even cave paintings showing hunting scenes. The evidence is undeniable that humans hunted these animals. The question is whether hunting alone could cause extinctions, or whether it was just the final straw for populations already struggling with climate change. The timing is certainly suspicious in many regions. In North America, the extinctions coincide almost exactly with the expansion of Clovis culture, a group of humans with particularly effective hunting technology. Clovis points, these distinctive spear points, are found at sites with butchered mammoth remains. Within a few thousand years of Clovis people spreading across North America, the megafauna were gone. That's awfully coincidental timing. A study of the Anzac child, the only known Clovis individual, provides some interesting evidence. This was an 18-month-old child buried about 700 years ago in Montana. Scientists analyzed isotopes from the bones to reconstruct the diet of the child's mother, and they found that mammoth contributed around 40% of the maternal protein diet, similar to the diet of specialized mammoth predators like scimitar cats. This suggests Clovis people were heavily targeting mammoths, possibly as specialized mammoth hunters. But we need to be careful not to overinterpret. The Anzac child is one individual. We can't say all Clovis people had the same diet or hunting focus. The disappearance of the Ice Age giants, it's a story that still puzzles me. We debate the exact numbers, of course. Could relatively small groups of humans have truly hunted mammoths to extinction across an entire continent? Some scientists remain skeptical, and I understand why. The extinction patterns themselves are so varied. Some species vanished early on, while others held on for much longer. The mammoths on Wrangel Island, for example, persisted until around 4,000 years ago, millennia after their mainland counterparts disappeared. Cave bears were gone before many others, and while dire wolves vanished, the gray wolves survived. Bison, despite being heavily hunted, also made it. The reasons why some species survived and others didn't are still being unraveled. What seems clear is that the combination of climate change and human prey proved deadly. Climate change put immense stress on these megafauna populations, fragmenting their habitats and reducing their food sources. And then, human hunting prevented these already struggling populations from ever recovering. Together, these factors created a perfect storm that most megafauna simply couldn't weather. There may have also been indirect effects. Humans extensively used fire to manage landscapes, which in turn altered vegetation patterns. The loss of the megafauna themselves also had profound ecosystem effects. Mammoths and other large herbivores acted as ecosystem engineers, maintaining open grasslands. When they disappeared, these grasslands transformed into forests, making the habitat even less suitable for any remaining megafauna. It's a cascade of interconnected effects. What we are left with is this. The 100,000-year cycle had sustained megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. In the cold phases, they thrived. In the warm phases, they retreated to refugia. Then in the cold phases, they expanded again. It was a rhythm to which life had adapted. But this time, when the cycle shifted to warming, there was a new factor: humans with sophisticated hunting technology and growing populations. The combination of rapid climate change and human prey proved too much for most megafauna to handle. Within a few thousand years, the Ice Age world of giants was gone forever. Now, I want to turn our attention to the humans who lived through these 100,000-year cycles, because their story is just as fascinating as that of the megafauna. And when I say humans, I'm talking about multiple species. We weren't the only ones around during the Ice Age. Neanderthals were already well established when our ancestors showed up, and they deserve far more credit than they usually receive. Neanderthals were the original Ice Age survivors. They evolved in Europe and parts of Asia hundreds of thousands of years ago, living through these glacial cycles long before modern humans ever left Africa. They weren't some brutish, primitive dead end. They were sophisticated, intelligent humans who had adapted incredibly well to glacial conditions. Their adaptations were, in a word, brilliant. Consider their body structure. Neanderthals were short and stocky with barrel chests and thick, heavy bones. The average male was only about 106 centimeters tall, but they were built like tanks. Seriously muscular, with bones showing massive muscle attachment sites. This wasn't random. It was an adaptation to the cold. Shorter, stockier bodies have less surface area relative to their volume, which means less heat loss. This is Bergmann's rule in action, the same principle that made Ice Age megafauna so large. In cold climates, compact bodies retain heat better, and their faces were distinctive with large noses and wide nasal passages. This wasn't for aesthetics. Those big nasal cavities acted like built-in air conditioners, warming and humidifying the frigid, dry air before it reached the lungs. Breathing super cold air repeatedly can damage lung tissue, so this was crucial. It's the same adaptation we see in woolly mammoths with their enlarged sinuses. Different species, same solution to the same problem. Convergent evolution at work. But physical adaptations only tell part of the story. Neanderthals had a sophisticated culture and technology. They made complex stone tools using the Levallois technique, where you carefully prepare a core and then strike off flakes of predetermined shapes. This requires planning and mental visualization. You have to see the finished tool in your mind before you start working the stone. They also made wooden spears, carefully shaped and balanced, with tips hardened by fire. Some of these spears have been found preserved in German peat bogs, and they're beautifully crafted. Neanderthals hunted big, dangerous game. We've found Neanderthal sites with bones of bison, reindeer, wild horses, even woolly rhinoceros and mammoth. These weren't scavenged carcasses. The bones show clear butchery marks made with stone tools, while the meat was fresh. Neanderthals were actively hunting animals that could easily kill them if the hunt went wrong. That requires coordination, communication, planning, and courage. They used fire extensively and effectively, not just for warmth and cooking, but for making complex adhesives. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal tools with birch bark tar used to attach stone points to wooden handles. Making birch bark tar requires heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen at specific temperatures. This is a multi-step process that requires technical knowledge and careful control. You can't just stumble into figuring this out. They understood the process and could replicate it reliably. Even more impressive, Neanderthals had symbolic culture. They made ornamental objects, pierced shells, and eagle talons that were apparently worn as jewelry. They used pigments, possibly for body painting or decorating objects or cave walls, and they buried their dead, sometimes with what appear to be grave goods or in deliberate postures. There's a famous burial at Shanidar Cave in Iraq that includes evidence that might suggest flowers were placed in the grave, though that's still debated. The question that haunts me most is this: if Neanderthals were so capable, so well adapted, why did they disappear? The last of them died out around 40,000 years ago, just as modern humans were spreading across Europe from Africa and the Middle East. It feels too coincidental. Did we outcompete them, absorb them through interbreeding, or did we kill them off directly? The truth, as always, is complex. The genetic evidence is clear. Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. If you're of European or Asian descent, you likely carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It might not sound like much, but it proves our ancestors were having children together, children who survived and had their own children. Some Neanderthal genes persist today, influencing our immune function, skin and hair traits, and even our susceptibility to certain diseases. So, in a way, Neanderthals didn't completely vanish. They were absorbed into the modern human gene pool. But as a distinct population, with their own culture and identity, they didn't survive. And why? Demographics likely played a key role. Modern human populations appear to have been larger and more widespread. When two populations compete for the same resources, the larger one usually wins simply through numbers. Even if individual Neanderthals were as capable as individual modern humans, being outnumbered 10 to 1 would eventually lead to being overwhelmed. Modern humans also seem to have had technological advantages. While Neanderthals crafted excellent tools, modern humans developed more diverse and specialized toolkits. They created fine bone needles for sewing-fitted clothing, which offered better insulation. They fashioned fishing equipment like hooks and harpoons, expanding their food sources. They produced more prolific art and ornaments, perhaps indicating more complex social structures or better communication systems. Modern humans also maintained wider trade networks. We find materials at modern human sites that originated hundreds of kilometers away, evidence of exchanging goods over large distances. Neanderthal trade networks were more localized, and trade isn't just about the objects themselves. It's about the exchange of information and social connections. Wider networks mean more people sharing ideas and innovations, accelerating cultural evolution and adaptation. Some researchers believe modern humans might have had slightly better language abilities, allowing for more complex planning and coordination. Or perhaps they had different social structures that were more effective at acquiring resources or raising children. These are subtle differences not immediately obvious in archaeological remains, but over generations they could compound into significant advantages. Climate, too, might have played a role. The late Ice Age was incredibly unstable, with rapid swings between cold and warm. Perhaps Neanderthals, specialized for cold, stable conditions, struggled more with these rapid fluctuations. Modern humans coming from Africa with its own climate variability might have been more adaptable to changing conditions. But this is speculative. We don't truly know. What's clear is that by 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals were gone, and modern humans were the only human species left in Europe. And we were spreading everywhere, adapting to every environment Earth had to offer. By the end of the last glacial period, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica, having survived the 100,000-year cycle at its most extreme phase. During the late Ice Age, modern humans developed an impressive array of technologies. Projectile weapons were a game-changer. Early humans used thrusting spears, which required getting close to prey, dangerous when hunting mammoth. Then they invented the atlatl, a spear thrower that acts as a lever arm, dramatically increasing throwing range and power. Suddenly, they could attack from tens of meters away, much safer. Later, probably between 20,000 and 30,000 years ago in some regions, humans invented the bow and arrow. This was huge. Arrows are faster and more accurate than atlatl darts. You can carry more ammunition. You can hunt smaller, faster animals more effectively. The bow might be one of the most important technological innovations in human history. It fundamentally changed how humans could acquire food and defend themselves. Hunting strategies became more sophisticated, too. There's evidence of drive hunting, where groups would herd animals toward cliffs or into constructed traps, sites with hundreds of bison or horses driven off cliffs and butchered. This requires serious coordination among large groups of people, scouts, drivers, people positioned at the cliff to finish off injured animals, butchers, all working together with precise timing. It's complex social behavior that requires communication and planning. Fishing also became important. Humans developed harpoons, fish hooks made from bone, nets, and opened up aquatic resources as a food source. I've often wondered about the moment when humans truly became us. When did we become behaviorally modern? It seems the Ice Age was the crucible. The technological innovations, the social structures, the symbolic thinking, all developed or were refined during the harsh conditions of glacial cycles. We are, in a very real sense, products of the Ice Age. One crucial adaptation was diet. Fishing became a major food source, especially in coastal and riverine areas. And compared to hunting mammoths, fishing was relatively low risk. Coastal sites reveal intensive exploitation of fish and shellfish, with enormous shell middens representing thousands upon thousands of meals. Clothing technology also improved dramatically. Bone needles, appearing around 40,000 years ago, allowed for sewing-fitted clothing with sleeves and clothes. If you've ever tried staying warm simply by wrapping animal hides around yourself, you know it's not very effective. Fitted clothing is far better at trapping body heat. This technology likely allowed humans to survive in even colder regions and remain active during winter instead of just hunkering down. Shelter evolved, too. In regions with scarce wood, people built structures using mammoth bones and tusks as frameworks, covered with hides. These mammoth bone houses have been found in Ukraine and Russia. Some used bones from dozens of individual mammoths, representing thousands of kilograms of material. These were substantial dwellings, not temporary camps. People were investing serious effort into creating comfortable, long-term living spaces. And let's not forget art. Ice Age humans created stunning artwork. Cave paintings like those at Lascaux and Chauvet in France are justly famous. These aren't crude drawings. They're sophisticated, dynamic images of animals rendered with incredible skill and accuracy. The artists used the natural contours of cave walls to create three-dimensional effects. They mixed pigments to achieve different colors and understood techniques like shading and perspective. Some paintings even show animals in motion, running or fighting, capturing movement in a static image. But it wasn't just cave paintings. People carved figurines from ivory, bone, and stone. The Venus figurines, stylized female forms found across Europe, date to this period. Some have elaborate details like hairstyles or clothing carved into them. People made musical instruments, flutes carved from bird bones or mammoth ivory. They created elaborate burials with grave goods, including thousands of ivory beads sewn onto clothing. One burial of children at Sunir in Russia included so many beads that researchers estimated it would have taken thousands of hours to make them. These people valued symbolic expression enough to invest enormous time and effort into it. Why did humans create art? Probably for many reasons. Some cave art might have been connected to hunting magic or spiritual rituals. Some figurines might have been religious or fertility symbols. Some art was probably just for aesthetic plea or social bonding. The point is, Ice Age humans weren't just focused on survival. They had rich inner lives, symbolic thinking, spiritual beliefs, and cultural traditions. They were fully modern mentally and behaviorally, even though they lived in conditions we'd find incredibly harsh. Human populations during the Ice Age weren't huge by modern standards. Estimates suggest maybe just a few million people worldwide. But those people had spread across most habitable regions. They'd reached Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, crossing significant water gaps even during low sea levels. They'd spread throughout Asia and Europe. And critically, they'd made it to the Americas. The peopling of the Americas is fascinating. During peak glaciation, when sea levels were low, the Bering Land Bridge connected Asia and North America. But this wasn't just a narrow strip. Beringia was a vast region, probably thousands of kilometers wide, with its own ecosystems. Humans crossed it, probably following game animals, entering a continent with no previous human population and megafauna that had never encountered human hunters. The timing is still debated. The oldest widely accepted sites in the Americas date to about 15 to 16,000 years ago, but there are controversial sites that might be older, suggesting people could have arrived as early as 20 to 30,000 years ago. Either way, once humans were in the Americas, they spread incredibly fast. Within just a few thousand years, there's evidence of human presence from Alaska to the southern tip of South America. That's an incredible migration speed. And remember, the American megafauna went extinct shortly after humans arrived. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels, all gone within a few thousand years of human appearance. The timing suggests humans played a major role. The Clovis people, with their distinctive spear points and apparent focus on hunting mammoths, have been particularly implicated. But it's complicated. Climate was changing rapidly at the same time. It's probably both factors working together. By the time the Holocene began 11,700 years ago, humans were the dominant large animal on multiple continents. We'd outlasted Neanderthals and other human species. We'd survived the wild climate swings of deglaciation. We'd adapted to every environment, from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra. And we developed incredibly diverse cultures and technologies. Despite being one species genetically, humans showed cultural diversity that no other species has ever matched. This set the stage for what came next, the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. But that's a different chapter in the story. The point is, the Ice Age and its 100,000-year cycle was the crucible that forged modern human behavior. Our success as a species was built on adaptations to a frozen world. And now, that world is gone, melted away, as the cycle shifted to its warm phase. The question is, I sometimes wonder if we're truly adapted to the world we inhabit now. Are we just carrying evolutionary baggage from an ice age that ended millennia ago? That 100,000-year cycle has undeniably shifted. The megafauna are mostly gone, and humans now live in a world entirely different from what our ancestors knew for hundreds of thousands of years. We're now in the Holocene, our current interglacial period, and it's here that everything changes for human societies. Around 11,700 years ago, as the Younger Dryas cold snap finally ended, temperatures rose rapidly, stabilizing into conditions remarkably similar to today. The climate became warmer and wetter than it had been during the glacial period. Forests expanded massively, spreading across what had been cold grasslands and tundra. Sea levels continued to rise as the last major ice sheets melted, flooding coastlines and shaping the geography we recognize. It was a dramatic and relatively fast transformation. For humans who had been living as hunter-gatherers, this presented both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, warmer temperatures meant longer growing seasons, more diverse vegetation, and a more predictable climate. But on the other hand, the megafauna they'd been hunting were disappearing. Those massive herds of mammoth, bison, and horses, which had been reliable food sources, were gone or going extinct. Humans had to adapt their subsistence strategies quickly or face serious problems. In some regions, people turned heavily to fishing and gathering shellfish. Coastal sites from this period show enormous shell middens and fish bone deposits, testament to how stable and productive the ocean had become, providing reliable sustenance. In other regions, people focused more on smaller game like deer, rabbits, and birds, supplementing their diet with gathered nuts, seeds, roots, and berries. These smaller animals required different hunting techniques than the megafauna. You can't drive deer off cliffs effectively. You need different tools, different strategies. But in a few special regions, something revolutionary happened. People started deliberately planting and cultivating wild plants. This was the very beginning of agriculture, and it changed everything about human society. The first clear evidence of agriculture appears in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, around 11 to 10,000 years ago. People started cultivating wheat and barley, domesticating sheep and goats. In China, rice and millet cultivation began around 9,000 years ago. In Mesoamerica, maize was domesticated around the same time in multiple regions independently. Within just a few thousand years of each other, humans invented farming. Why did agriculture develop when it did? That's a question that's been debated forever. One theory points to population prees. During the Ice Age, human populations were kept relatively small by harsh conditions and limited food resources. But as the Holocene began and conditions improved, populations might have grown to the point where hunting and gathering couldn't support everyone. Agriculture produces more calories per unit of land than hunting and gathering, so it can support higher population densities. If your population outgrows your hunting territory, you either starve, migrate, or innovate. Some groups chose innovation. Another theory emphasizes climate stability. Agriculture requires planning for the future. You plant seeds and wait months for the harvest. This only makes sense if you can reasonably predict that conditions will remain suitable for plant growth. During the wildly fluctuating climate of the late Ice Age, with events like the Younger Dryas, that wasn't a safe bet. But during the Holocene, climate became more stable and predictable. You could plant in spring and be reasonably confident summer would come and your crops would mature. This stability made agriculture viable in a way it hadn't been before. There's also a theory that the Younger Dryas specifically triggered agriculture in the Middle East. The idea is that hunter-gatherers in the Fertile Crescent had developed semi-sedentary lifestyles during the warm period before the Younger Dryas, living in villages and intensively harvesting wild grains. Then the Younger Dryas hit, and those wild grains became less productive. To maintain their lifestyles and avoid starvation, people started actively cultivating the grains, selecting for varieties that produced more food. When the Younger Dryas ended, they were already farming and just continued. Whatever triggered it, agriculture spread rapidly once it started, and it came with a massive package of changes to human society. You can't be nomadic and farm effectively. You need to stay in one place to tend crops and protect them from animals and thieves. So agriculture led to permanent settlements, villages that grew into towns, and eventually cities. These settlements required new forms of social organization. Who controls the land? How do you store surplus food? How do you defend your settlement? How do you resolve disputes? Agriculture also changed human diets dramatically, and not always for the better. Hunter-gatherers typically had diverse diets with lots of protein and varied nutrients from many plant and animal sources. Early farmers ate mostly carbohydrates from a few grain crops, supplemented with whatever else they could grow or gather. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show signs of nutritional stress compared to hunter-gatherers. More cavities from all the starchy foods, shorter average stature, diseases associated with dietary deficiencies. Agriculture allowed population growth, but individual health often declined. Disease became a much bigger problem once humans started living in permanent settlements. When you're nomadic and moving frequently, your waste gets left behind, and diseases don't have time to build up. But in permanent villages, the rise of agriculture, it turns out, wasn't just about food, it was about disease. High population densities, waste accumulation, contaminated water, and close contact with domestic animals. These created perfect conditions for infectious diseases. It's a sobering thought that many of the diseases that plague us today, measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, they originated in domestic animals. They jumped to humans after we started living so closely with livestock. Farming, in essence, made us more vulnerable to epidemics. Yet it also held an overwhelming advantage. It could support far more people per unit of land. I find myself pondering the sheer scale of this shift. A square kilometer of wheat fields can sustain dozens, even hundreds of people. The same area of wild land might support only a handful of hunter-gatherers. This meant agricultural societies could grow into much larger populations. More people meant more workers, more soldiers, more inventors, more of everything. And when these agricultural societies encountered hunter-gatherer societies, the farmers usually won, simply through sheer numbers, even if individual hunter-gatherers were healthier or better warriors. Over just a few thousand years, agriculture spread across most of the world where the climate allowed. Sometimes this happened through the migration of farming peoples, displacing or absorbing hunter-gatherers. Other times, hunter-gatherers adopted farming from their agricultural neighbors. Either way, most humans transitioned from mobile hunting and gathering to sedentary farming. This, in turn, set the stage for the rise of complex civilizations. Permanent settlements grew into cities. These cities required food from surrounding agricultural areas, which led to the development of trade networks. Trade required record-keeping, which spurred the invention of writing in multiple regions independently. Complex societies developed hierarchies, with rulers, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and slaves forming different social classes. Organized religion became more prominent, with monumental architecture like temples and pyramids built to honor gods or rulers. Specialized occupations emerged as some people focused full-time on pottery, metalworking, weaving, or administration instead of food production. The first civilizations emerged in river valleys where agriculture was particularly productive. Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley in South Asia, the Yellow River in China. These civilizations developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, metallurgy, all the hallmarks of a complex society. It's astounding to consider that all of this happened within just a few thousand years of the Ice Age ending. The transformation from small mobile hunter-gatherer bands to cities with tens of thousands of people is incredibly rapid. But here's something important to remember. While these civilizations were rising, there were still hunter-gatherer societies living successfully in other parts of the world. Australia's Aboriginal peoples maintained their hunter-gatherer lifestyles for tens of thousands of years after agriculture was invented elsewhere. In the Americas, many groups remained hunter-gatherers, even while others developed agriculture and built cities. In Africa, groups like the San people hunted and gathered successfully until very recently. Some still do. Agriculture wasn't inevitable or universally adopted. It was one strategy among many, one that happened to be very successful at supporting large populations in complex societies, but not the only viable way to live. The ecological consequences of this Holocene transition were profound. It wasn't just about the megafauna extinction. Forests expanded dramatically, changing countless ecosystems. Species adapted to open grasslands had to move, adapt, or go extinct. Cold-adapted species retreated northward or to higher elevations. Warm-adapted species expanded their ranges. The distribution of species across the planet shifted massively within just a few thousand years, and humans were increasingly shaping these ecosystems, often in ways we didn't fully appreciate until recently. Indigenous peoples around the world used fire as a landscape management tool, burning regularly to maintain open areas that attracted game animals or promoted the growth of useful plants. This burning had huge effects on vegetation patterns. What we think of as natural, pristine ecosystems are often actually anthropogenic, shaped by thousands of years of human fire management. In Australia, Aboriginal burning transformed large areas from dense forest to open woodland and grassland. In North America, Native American burning maintained vast prairies and savannas that might otherwise have been forested. When Europeans arrived and disrupted these burning practices, ecosystems often shifted dramatically. Forests grew in where they hadn't been for millennia. Fire-adapted species declined, while fire-sensitive species increased. The wilderness Europeans saw wasn't pristine nature. It was often the result of thousands of years of active human management. The extinction of megafauna also had cascading ecological effects that we're still trying to fully understand. Mega herbivores like mammoths weren't just eating plants. They were ecosystem engineers. They knocked down trees, maintained open areas, distributed nutrients through their dung, created trails and wallows. When they disappeared, these functions disappeared too. Some scientists think forests expanded after the Ice Age partly because there were no longer giant herbivores suppressing tree growth. There's even a hypothesis that megafauna extinction contributed to climate change. Large herbivores produce a lot of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, from their digestive systems. When megafauna populations crashed, methane emissions might have decreased significantly, and the transformation from open grasslands to forests changed the reflectivity of the land surface, affecting how much solar energy was absorbed versus reflected. The loss of those massive creatures, the megafauna, it wasn't just a loss of food for human societies. For thousands of years, we had hunted them, depended on them. Their disappearance meant a loss of materials, too. I think of mammoth ivory, used for tools, art, even construction. Hides provided clothing and shelter. Bones became needles, dwelling frameworks. Their disappearance forced us to find substitutes. Perhaps that even drove technological innovation. In a way, the extinction of the megafauna might have accelerated the transition to agriculture in some regions. If your primary food source vanishes and hunting smaller game isn't enough, you either starve or find a new way. Agriculture became that new way. It's strange to consider that the extinctions that ended the Ice Age world may have inadvertently pushed humans toward the lifestyles that created modern civilization. The Holocene, the time since the last Ice Age, has been unusually stable. Yes, there have been variations, warm and cold periods, droughts and floods, but nothing like the dramatic swings of the Pleistocene, with its rapid warming and cooling, and this stability, I believe, has helped civilizations develop. It's difficult to build cities and plan agriculture when the climate might change dramatically within a generation. Holocene stability allowed humans to make long-term plans, investments, building irrigation systems, and monumental architecture that took decades, even centuries, to complete. Of course, different parts of the world experience the Holocene differently. The Sahara Desert, a vast, empty wasteland now, was once green and wet. From about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, increased monsoon activity brought more rain to North Africa. Rivers flowed, where tea now only desert. Lakes filled valleys. Vegetation covered areas that are now bare sand. People lived throughout the region, herding cattle and developing agriculture. I've seen rock art from this period, depicting hippos, giraffes, elephants, animals that seem impossibly out of place today. But then, around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoons weakened, and the Sahara dried out relatively rapidly. Within just a few centuries, the Green Sahara became the desert we know. This desertification forced populations to migrate, many moving to the Nile Valley, where water remained. Some historians believe this migration and concentration along the Nile contributed to the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. It's all interconnected. Climate change driving human migration, driving civilization development. Similar stories played out elsewhere. The Middle East was relatively wet in the early Holocene, supporting agriculture and early civilizations. But droughts have repeatedly stressed or collapsed civilizations. In Mesoamerica, droughts have been linked to the collapse of Maya civilization. In the American Southwest, extended droughts forced abandonment of settlements like Mesa Verde. Climate variability during the Holocene has been a constant factor shaping human history, even though the swings were mild compared to the Ice Age. And here we are now, roughly 11,700 years into the current interglacial. Based on past interglacials, we should eventually slide back into glacial conditions at some point. Different models give different predictions. Some suggest we have thousands of years before the next glaciation begins. Others think tens of thousands. The orbital cycles are complex and their effects don't always line up predictably. But there's a massive wild card now. Human activity is affecting global climate on a scale that might override the natural cycles entirely. We've increased atmospheric carbon dioxide from the natural interglacial level of about 280 parts per million to over 420 parts per million. That's a 50% increase in just a couple of centuries. The ice core records going back 800,000 years show nothing like this. We're in completely uncharted territory. And this brings us to the big question. What happens next? It's interesting and honestly a bit scary. We've spent this whole time talking about how the 100,000-year cycle has controlled Earth's climate for millions of years, creating ice ages and shaping the evolution of life, including humans. But now, for the first time in the history of this cycle, one species has the power to override it. That species is us. Some scientists believe we've already delayed or canceled the next glaciation. The extra carbon dioxide we've pumped into the atmosphere, warming the planet, making it unlikely that northern hemisphere summers will be cool enough to allow ice sheet formation, even when the orbital cycles shift toward glacial conditions. We might have prevented the next ice age from ever happening. Sounds good, right? Nobody wants kilometers of ice covering Canada and Scandinavia again. But the problem is, we're not just preventing the next ice age. We're warming the planet way beyond normal interglacial conditions. And we're doing it incredibly fast. Let's talk about what we've learned from studying ice age cycles and why it matters right now. First, and most importantly, the climate system has tipping points. It's not linear or gradual. You can push the system for a while and see only small changes, then suddenly cross a threshold and boom! Rapid, dramatic shifts happen. The Younger Dryas is the perfect example. Gradual warming, then catastrophic freshwater flooding, then abrupt climate reversal within decades. The system flipped states faster than human lifetimes. We're seeing similar threshold behavior today in multiple parts of the climate. Ice sheets don't just melt in a uniform way. They can remain stable for very long stretches, and then, quite suddenly, the melting accelerates when they reach a critical point. I find that idea both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It's a reminder that the Earth's systems are not always predictable. Ocean circulation patterns, like the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, can weaken gradually, but there's a potential for them to shut down relatively rapidly. Permafrost, frozen for millennia, can abruptly thaw, releasing greenhouse gases and amplifying warming. These aren't smooth, linear processes. They are systems where even a small additional push can trigger a large response, and we're pushing multiple systems toward their tipping points simultaneously. Arctic sea ice is declining dramatically. The minimum extent in summer has dropped about 40% since satellite measurements began in the 1970s. Some models even suggest we could see ice-free Arctic summers within decades. And it's all interconnected with feedback loops. Ice reflects sunlight, ocean water absorbs it, less ice means more heat absorption, which means more warming, which means more ice loss. It's self-reinforcing. The Greenland ice sheet is losing mass at an accelerating rate, around 250 billion tons per year in recent measurements. It contains enough ice to raise global sea levels by about 7 meters if it all melted. While no one expects it to melt completely anytime soon, even losing a fraction over the coming centuries would massively impact coastlines worldwide. And once major melting starts, feedback effects make it incredibly difficult to stop. Exposed darker rock absorbs more heat. Meltwater lubricates the ice base, making it flow faster. Warm ocean water gets underneath and melts it from below. All positive feedbacks amplifying the initial change. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly concerning because much of it sits on bedrock below sea level. Warm ocean water is already getting underneath it, causing melting. Some scientists believe that major portions might be committed to collapse over the coming centuries, even if we stopped warming today. If that happens, we're looking at 3 to 5 meters of sea level rise. That would remake coastlines globally and displace hundreds of millions of people. The carbon cycle is being disrupted in ways that mirror the Ice Age cycles, but reversed and much faster. During glacial periods, carbon dioxide dropped to around 180 to 200 parts per million. During interglacials, it rose to about 280 to 300 parts per million. This roughly 100 parts per million swing took tens of thousands of years, driven by natural ocean and vegetation processes. We've increased carbon dioxide by over 140 parts per million in just over a century. We're replicating the natural cycle's entire range in a tiny fraction of the time. And we're blowing past natural interglacial levels into territory Earth hasn't seen for millions of years. The last time carbon dioxide was this high was probably the Pliocene epoch, around 3 million years ago. Back then, temperatures were several degrees warmer than today, sea levels were 15 to 25 meters higher, and the Arctic was forested instead of ice-covered. That's where we're headed if we don't change course. And the rate matters as much as the magnitude. Ecosystems can adapt to gradual changes over thousands of years. Species migrate. Evolution selects for new traits. Ecological communities reassemble. But when change happens in decades or centuries, there's no time for gradual adaptation. Species either move fast enough or they go extinct. We're already seeing range shifts in thousands of species. Plants flowering earlier, animals moving toward poles or up mountains, ocean species shifting to cooler waters. Some species are adapting successfully, others aren't, and we're likely headed for another extinction wave. Maybe not as dramatic as the megafauna extinctions, but significant nonetheless. Current extinction rates are already elevated above background, and climate change is adding another major stressor on top of habitat loss and pollution. Here's something that keeps scientists up at night. During Ice Age cycles, carbon dioxide changes were a feedback, not a forcing. Orbital variations changed sunlight distribution. This affected temperature. Temperature changes affected ocean chemistry and vegetation, which changed atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide then amplified the temperature changes. It was a feedback loop within the system responding to external astronomical forcing. But what we're doing is different. We're directly forcing carbon dioxide changes by burning fossil fuels. This is direct forcing, not feedback. And all those natural feedbacks that amplified carbon dioxide changes during Ice Age cycles, they're still operating. They're amplifying the changes we're causing. We're pushing on a system with built-in amplifiers, and we don't fully understand all of them or where the thresholds are. Permafrost is a huge wild card. There's around 1,500 billion tons of organic carbon stored in frozen Arctic soils. That's roughly twice as much carbon as currently in the atmosphere. As the Arctic warms, permafrost thaws and microbes start decomposing that organic matter, releasing carbon dioxide and methane. Classic feedback. Warming causes thawing. Thawing releases greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases cause more warming. How fast this happens is uncertain, but the potential for permafrost to become a major additional carbon source is real and scary. The ocean has absorbed about 90% of extra heat trapped by greenhouse gases so far, which has slowed atmospheric warming, but at the cost of warming the ocean itself. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen. We're already seeing expanding dead zones where oxygen has dropped too low to support most life. Marine organisms are stressed by warming, acidification from dissolved carbon dioxide, and oxygen loss simultaneously. Coral reefs are being devastated by repeated bleaching events. These ecosystems that support enormous biodiversity are collapsing. There's a paradox hidden in global warming. It could trigger regional cooling. I find that incredibly counterintuitive, yet climate, as I've come to understand it, is full of such complexities. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, or AMO, shows signs of weakening, and if it shuts down significantly, parts of Europe could experience cooling, much like what happened during the Younger Dryas. What do we do with this knowledge? Well, understanding the 100,000-year cycle reveals that Earth's climate is incredibly sensitive to even small changes. The orbital variations that trigger ice ages cause only tiny changes in seasonal sunlight distribution. Yet, combined with feedback loops, they're enough to tip the entire system. We're now applying a forcing that's much larger and faster than these orbital variations, so the response will be substantial. It's just a question of how substantial and on what time scale. Climate also has momentum. Ice sheets take thousands of years to grow, but they can collapse much faster. Once major melting begins, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult. Ocean circulation changes can be equally hard to reverse. Some of the changes we're causing are essentially irreversible on human timescales. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, temperatures would remain elevated for centuries as the ocean and atmosphere slowly reach equilibrium. Sea levels would continue to rise for centuries, even millennia, as ice sheets respond to the warming already in motion. It's uncomfortable to contemplate, isn't it? We've likely already committed to significant changes, even with aggressive emission reductions. Some warming, some sea level rise, some ecosystem disruption is already locked in. The crucial question now is how much more we add. Every bit of additional warming makes things worse. Every tenth of a degree matters when we're dealing with systems that have tipping points. The paleoclimate record teaches us that rapid climate change is incredibly hard on societies. Climate changes at the end of the Ice Age contributed to megafauna extinctions and forced major shifts in human subsistence. Droughts during the Holocene toppled civilizations, and those were natural variations, changes over which societies had no control. We're now causing changes faster and potentially larger than those natural variations. With over 8 billion people to feed and house, many in areas vulnerable to climate change, the implications are staggering. Coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise. Agricultural regions face shifting rainfall patterns and more extreme weather. Water resources are stressed by changing precipitation and glacial melt. Tropical regions could see temperatures exceeding human survivability thresholds for outdoor work during heat waves. Island nations could literally disappear. The humanitarian implications are enormous and unequally distributed. Those who contributed least to causing climate change are often the most vulnerable to its effects. But understanding the problem is the first step toward addressing it. We know more about climate now than ever before. We can see changes happening in real time with satellites and monitoring. We can model future scenarios with increasing accuracy. And we have technologies available that could dramatically reduce emissions if deployed at scale. Solar and wind are now cost competitive with fossil fuels in many places. Electric vehicles are becoming mainstream. Energy storage is improving. Carbon capture is being developed, though it's not yet proven at the necessary scale. The challenge isn't really technological anymore. It's political, economic, and social. Getting 8 billion people to coordinate on emission reductions, equitably distributing costs and benefits, and navigating competing interests, that's the hard part. Climate change is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. Individual actors benefit from burning fossil fuels, but everyone suffers the consequences. Solving it requires collective action on a scale humanity has never achieved. Some people feel despair. The problem seems too big, changes too slow, obstacles too numerous. I understand that feeling, but humans have navigated existential challenges before. We survived the Ice Age through adaptation and innovation. We transitioned from hunting megafauna to agriculture, fundamentally transforming our relationship with the planet. We've overcome diseases, expanded lifespans, and created technologies that would seem like magic to our ancestors. We're not helpless. We're just facing a problem requiring unprecedented coordination. The 100,000-year cycle will eventually resume, assuming we don't permanently alter it. The orbital mechanics haven't changed. Naturally, Earth would eventually slide back into glacial conditions tens of thousands of years from now. But we're writing a new chapter, one where human activity is a major climate driver, not just a responder. We're affecting the planet on a scale comparable to the astronomical forces that controlled climate for millions of years. No species has ever had this influence. It's both inspiring and terrifying. Future geologists studying sediments millions of years from now will see a clear marker. They'll see isotope ratios reflecting massive carbon combustion, extinction signatures, novel materials like plastics and concrete in the sediment, They'll recognize something unprecedented happened during this brief moment. Whether they'll also see evidence that we successfully navigated the crisis, that's still open. The answer depends on what we do in the coming decades. The cycle reminds us that climate is dynamic, sensitive to forcing, and full of feedbacks and tipping points. It's not a stable, unchanging background. It's an active system responding to inputs. For millions of years, those inputs were natural. Now, we're adding a new input, and the system is responding. We're living through a moment unlike any other in Earth's 4.5 billion years. Never before has a single species understood the global climate system while simultaneously altering it. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That we possess knowledge and power no organism has ever possessed. What we do with that power now determines Earth's trajectory for thousands, even millions of years. No prez, as they say. The Ice Age cycles show us that life is, at its core, resilient. Earth has weathered dramatic climate changes, and life has always found a way to survive, adapt, and even thrive. Life survived the asteroid that extinguished the dinosaurs. It survived ice ages. It will survive this too. The real question isn't whether life will endure, but whether human civilization as we know it will thrive. Or will we face massive disruptions that could have been avoided with foresight and decisive action? I began by talking about the mystery of the 100,000-year cycle and how scientists patiently unraveled it. That very same scientific community is now sounding the alarm about anthropogenic climate change, employing the same rigorous methods that revealed the secrets of Ice Age cycles. If we place our trust in the science that illuminated the past, shouldn't we also heed its predictions for the future? It's becoming increasingly clear that we're pushing the system hard. We will see significant responses, and the window for averting the worst outcomes is rapidly closing. The Ice Age taught our ancestors the vital importance of adaptability and innovation. That spirit is in our DNA. We can harness those very traits to navigate the challenge we've created, but it requires collective and rapid action. The climate system possesses immense momentum and inherent time lags. Actions taken today won't fully manifest their effects for decades. However, inaction today commits us to changes that will unfold over centuries. Each year of delay only amplifies the eventual response, making it harder and more disruptive to manage. So, where does that leave us? We're 11,700 years into an interglacial period that should eventually come to an end. We are armed with an understanding of how climate works, and we are actively changing it at a pace that far exceeds natural processes. The 100,000-year cycle that shaped human evolution is now being overridden by human activity. We've become a geological force. The only question that remains is whether we will wield that power wisely or recklessly. The answer to that question will determine what kind of planet future generations inherit, and whether they'll view us as ancestors who rose to the challenge or as a cautionary tale of a species that understood the problem but ultimately failed to act. The clock is ticking. The cycle that sustained life for millions of years is still operating in the background. But for the first time, it might not matter, because, for the first time, one of the species it created has the power to override it. And what we do with that power in the next few decades will determine not just our future, but the future of countless other species who share this planet with us. The Ice Age is over. The question now is, what comes next? And unlike our ancestors, who simply had to survive the cycle, we have the power to shape it. That's both an incredible responsibility and an incredible opportunity. It's time to see what we do with it.